This is what my sewing table looked like after spending many months sewing many quilted bags, leaving me with many scraps. The more bags I sew, the smaller the scraps get. So today I've challenged myself to make a teeny tiny project using up some of these really beautiful scraps that I have left over from sewing bags. I'm Christy from Wholecloth Patterns. You can find more of my bag sewing patterns and video sewing tutorials in the notes below the video. So today we're going to do a little scrap busting, and I'm going to help you sew this itty bitty little pouch that's perfect for holding earbuds. The Morris Charm is a really great beginner-friendly project. It's made with a single piece of quilted fabric. All of the edges and seams are bound, and it has this really simple hanging loop to attach it to any bag. It doesn't have any specialty hardware or fasteners. The opening is just overlapped fabric. It's just big enough to slide in a headphones case and just snug enough to keep the headphones from falling out. You can attach this bag charm to just about any bag with the fabric loop. Let's talk about fabric. Any lightweight woven fabric will work. You could use linen or cotton shirting or quilt cotton. I quilted together a couple pieces of linen with some single ply quilt batting. I use 100% cotton low loft batting, but if you don't have quilt batting, don't buy it for this project. You could substitute a layer of sweatshirt fleece or a couple of layers of flannel. Anything that will give the finished bag a little bit of body and doesn't have much stretch. Don't overthink it. If you don't like how it turns out, you can always make another one. I'm going to sew my pouch with fabric that I've already quilted and binding that I've already made. I have tutorials for both of these techniques, and I'll link to them in the notes below the video. I'll also list the dimensions of each piece and the quantity of binding because I go over it pretty quickly in the video. I've also got a tutorial on the blog if you would rather go through it at your own pace and read the instructions. Now, let's get started. To make the Morris Charm, you'll need 20 inches of straight grain double fold binding that is 1/2 inch wide. I've got a tutorial for how to make this, and it's linked below the video. I'm using a couple of smaller pieces just because I'm trying to use up the smallest scraps that I can. You also will need a 1 inch by 9 inch strip of fabric, and you want the grain or cross grain to go in the long direction so that there's no stretch in this because this is going to be the hanging loop. You'll also need a quilted rectangle of fabric that's 4.5 inches by 7 inches. I've already quilted this piece of fabric, and I've got a tutorial for quilting fabrics to make bags, and that's linked in the notes below this video. I'm just going to clean up the edges so I have a nice neat rectangle. Next, I'm going to move on and prepare the hanging loop. To make the hanging loop, we're going to follow more or less the same instructions that we use to make the double fold binding. We're going to fold the fabric in half lengthwise and press the fold into the fabric. Now we're going to make 2 more folds. All of the folds are toward the wrong side. My fabric is the same on both sides, so it doesn't matter. But if you've got a right side and a wrong side, you want to make these folds so that the wrong sides are together. So I'm folding each long edge toward the wrong side so that the edge of the fabric aligns with that center crease that we've already made. And I'm going to press those folds into my strip of fabric. I like to press it again to really set all of those folds so it's easier to sew. Next, we're going to secure these folds by sewing along this open edge. And you want your line of stitching to be about 1/8 of an inch, but as close as you're comfortable sewing to the open edge of these folds. When you're sewing a strip of fabric that's this narrow, it can be hard to get it to go through the sewing machine. You want to make sure it's traveling over the feed dogs, which are the teeth that are right here under the presser foot. So I usually move the needle over so that I can position my strip of fabric over the feed dogs and still have the needle hit the fabric. So I'm positioning my piece of fabric so that it is over the left feed dog, and then I'm just going to move my needle to the left until I'm sure that it will sew along the edge of my strip of fabric. Here's my finished hanging loop. I'm just going to set this aside and move on to start assembling the pouch. The first step we want to do is to bind each short edge of the rectangle. So if you're starting with a longer piece of binding, you just want to cut a strip of it that is either the same length as the seam that you're binding or just a tiny bit longer. So I'm going to go ahead and cut my longer piece in half so that it's just a tiny bit longer than the edge that I'm binding. I'm going to open up one side of my binding so that I have the raw edge exposed, and I'll align this raw edge with the edge of the quilted piece that I want to bind, and I'm going to pin that in place. Next, I'm going to sew a scant 1/2 inch seam along this edge. I like to keep my seam just under a 1/2 inch. I call it a scant 1/2 inch seam allowance, which can be a little bit vague, but basically I follow the 1/2 inch line on my sewing machine, but I move the needle a notch or two closer to that edge, so I've got a seam allowance that's just under 1/2 inch. Next, we're going to press our seam, and we're going to press the binding away from the body of the pouch. And when I do this, I want to be careful not to disturb the other folds that I've pressed into my binding. Now I'll turn it over and allow the binding to fold over the edge of the fabric around to the wrong side. And I'm going to clip this in place. I just want to be sure that the folded edge of my binding is covering the line of stitching that I just made. That's why I like to use the scant 1/2 inch seam allowance. It gives me a little bit of extra room to get around the added thickness of our quilted fabric. So I'm going to fold the binding around to the back side and make sure that this fold is covering that line of stitching. And if it isn't, I can ease out this fold a little bit to give me a little bit of extra room on the back side. Now I'm going to turn it back over to the right side and top stitch on the binding about 1/8 inch from this seam. You want to make sure that when you're stitching along the binding, you're catching this fold of fabric in the back, so you're sewing through all of the layers. For top stitching, I like to adjust my stitches to be a little bit longer. So I'm going to set my machine to a 3mm stitch length before I sew. Now I'm going to trim the ends of my binding so they align with the edge of my quilted piece. So there's one side bound, and I'm going to repeat these steps with the other short edge. Next, I'm going to find the center point of each of the long edges so I know where to position the hanging loop. I'm just going to fold it in half and match up the short side, and then put a pin at the midpoint along each edge. I'm going to fold the hanging loop loosely in half, and then with the right side of my pouch facing, I'll center the two ends of the hanging loop at the pin we just marked in the pouch, and I'm going to pin each side of the loop in place. At this point, I'm going to pause and baste across the top of the hanging loop to hold it in place while I'm assembling the rest of the bag. Now we're ready to shape the pouch. With the right side facing up and the end of the strap loop at the top of my rectangle, I'm going to fold in this right edge toward the right side, and I'm going to center my binding on this pin. And I don't usually measure this, I just eyeball it. So I'm going to go ahead and put in a few clips to hold that in place. And then I'm going to fold in the other side again, so right sides are together. But this time I want the two inner edges of my binding to line up. So I want to align this edge of one side of the binding with this edge of the other side of the binding so that it overlaps a little bit more with this fold. Once I have it aligned, I'll clip it in place. At this point, you could pause and baste all of these layers together just to simplify what you're working with, but I'm just going to skip ahead and attach my binding. To finish these interior seams, we'll use a piece of binding that is about an inch longer than the seam on either side. So once again, I'm going to open up my binding, position the raw edge along the edge of the seam, but with the binding centered, so I've got an equal amount of overhang on each side. I'm going to pin or clip this in place, and then I'm going to go ahead and sew this seam in the same way that we did when we did the outer edges. Once again, I'll press my binding away from the pouch. So I'll turn it over to the back and make sure that the fold of my binding covers the seam that we just made. And if it doesn't, you can adjust your fold a little bit so that you have enough to cover that line of stitching. And now my overhang is a little bit longer than I'd like it to be, so I'm going to trim it down a tiny bit. And then I'm going to open the binding up the whole way, fold over the overhang so it wraps around the pouch, and then I'm going to refold the binding. And this way, all of your raw edges are neatly concealed inside the fold. Now pin that in place, and then I'm going to repeat that with the other end. And now I'm ready to top stitch along the binding on the right side, making sure that I'm also catching the fold at the back. Here's one bound end of my pouch. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing to the other end, but first I'm going to pull the hanging loop so it's sticking out the opening so I don't run the risk of accidentally sewing it into my seam. Here's my finished pouch. The only thing left to do is to turn it right side out and poke out the corners. Thanks for sewing along with me today. I would love to see what you've made. You could leave a link in the comments or tag me on Instagram. And if you've made it this far, it really seems like you should subscribe. You can find more sewing tutorials and bag pattern sew-alongs on the Wholecloth Patterns sewing channel.